Hello, welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Ankur Desai, and today I'm joined by Pumza Filani, our correspondent in Johannesburg. We're going to talk about the growing anti-migrant protests that have swept across the country in recent weeks. And Pumza, this is something which has really gripped the nation. But first of all, just tell us what these protests are all about.
To answer that question, let's give a bit of context also about the makeup of South Africa currently. So South Africa is currently home to about 3 million foreign nationals. These are the official figures, but some estimates say this could be much higher, that the number of people that are not documented but are in the country could run a lot higher than that 3 million. Now, usually when foreign nationals come into South Africa, they'll tend to settle in areas where there are prospects for employment, to start businesses, and they'll tend to live in areas where housing is more readily affordable. So the townships, for example. Now, this context is important because the majority of South Africans find themselves in that setup as well. This is where the majority of Black South Africans particularly live. They live in the townships still, and they tend to be going for similar jobs if you're talking about people that are low-skilled labor. Now, this is the recipe that has brought about tensions in some of these communities and these protests that we've seen here in recent weeks, building up and culminating in that massive demonstration just a few days ago. Protesters, South African protesters particularly, are saying they are being muscled out of jobs. They're saying that they are being muscled out of jobs by companies that are, instead of hiring them, are hiring undocumented migrants so they can underpay them. This is the claim. The other one is that they are seeing firsthand a strain on public services. This is state hospitals saying it is very difficult to get proper health care across hospitals in the country because that they are saying that they're having to share these limited resources with foreign nationals. Now, it's a known phenomenon here in South Africa that people from neighboring countries, because of a collapse in other countries, tend to prefer to come and receive healthcare here in South Africa, whether as a short term or because they're already in country. So these are some of the two things that the protesters are complaining about.
And Pumza, this is something which has really swept across the country, as we mentioned at the start. Just tell us a bit about the atmosphere, not just in some of the big cities like Johannesburg, Cape Town, but in some of the smaller areas too.
Look, it's something that really has touched at the tensions that exist in some communities. Some have been simmering or bubbling under for years, some for months. But it's something really that's this past week has created a sense of anxiety for some people, particularly those who share these communities that I've just mentioned, particularly those who find themselves living in the township, who come face to face with South Africans who are out of work and believe they are the reasons that they are out of work. We've seen for weeks now talks of this unofficial deadline that was imposed by campaigners for all undocumented migrants to leave the country, saying that they want the government to take the lead on this, and they want to make sure that those people are repatriated by their home countries, and if not, they are deported by South Africa. So really just speaking to the heart of people feeling frustrated, South Africans feeling frustrated at what they say is a lack of proper immigration controls by the government, and foreign nationals on their part feeling that they're being scapegoated for problems that exist, they say, around unemployment, which they say they can't solve and have no part in.
So the government, no doubt, under a lot of pressure. What's their response been to all of this?
Look, they've tried to strike a balance in their response, I've noticed. So on the one hand, they've said that they understand the genuine grievances around staggering unemployment levels. We're talking about 30% of the country's population is unemployed. And some organizations say those figures could even be much higher. And a big part of that population is young people. Some of them are educated, some are not educated, but they're sitting at home and then they are unable to find jobs. So the government has said, look, we understand that these grievances are genuine, but on the other hand, we will not allow people to take the law into their own hands. This is in response to sporadic reports that we've seen of citizens doing what you would call stop searches on people that they find on the streets and wanting them to present proof of nationality and wanting to see people's documentation to see, are you here in South Africa legally or not? The government has said that is not allowed, and anyone found to be doing that will be arrested and charged with possible harassment and similar charges. And then on a broader scale, the country's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, addressed the nation just a few weeks ago, saying that they are looking at changing tact a little bit, that they recognize that there is a problem around immigration laws and some of the laws need to be tightened or better managed. So if I could just give you a quick sense here of what they're talking about doing. They're saying, firstly, what they want to do is start jailing people who employ undocumented migrants. This is a serious, they're saying this is a serious offense and they want to be seen to be taking it seriously. So that's the first one. The second, they say they want to set up courts which will be looking at fast-tracking deportations of people who are found to not have legal status in South Africa, so bypassing some of the delays that tend to happen in the courts. The other big one is that they want to relocate repatriation centers, which are normally found here in Johannesburg, for example. They want to move them and have them closer at border posts so that it's an easier transit between the border post into the receiving country. And lastly, they say they want to get better interaction and better cooperation from African governments, saying that for much too long, South Africa has borne a disproportionate amount of the burden of what happens when other African countries' economies struggle, that migration tends to move down towards South Africa. And they're saying that they are taking the strain for that and need African governments to also step up and help their citizens.
Pumza, I guess we want to get a sense of how people who are being targeted are feeling, because this must be quite intimidating and they really are at the centre and heart of what's going on.
They certainly have. I mean, I was at the protests earlier this week, this nationwide protest that had been touted for weeks, and it was really disheartening to see people reduced to 2 bags or a blanket who had left their homes with whatever belongings they could grab, fearing that something might happen. And on the part of the protests themselves, while they were largely peaceful around the country, there were pockets of crowds who really were angry. Angry at the helplessness of the situation, angry at what they feel is the government's failure to speedily address this. So really just an environment, creating an environment in some parts, certainly on the day that the protests were happening in some communities, that people are unwelcome. And that is something that the foreign nationals that I've spoken to have said they've grappled with, that they've lived here for a very long time. Some, yes, have said they do not have legal status, but they've created homes here. So it's a very delicate thing that needs to be managed.
And Pumza, we're also seeing people who are now being forced to leave South Africa, but they're also leaving some of their family members behind as well. Have we been hearing about some of their stories? Because that's another gut-wrenching part in all of this, where families are being separated because of this, and some people are leaving and going back to their home countries, but still leaving some members behind.
Yes, that's actually one of the areas that I visited earlier this week. Was I went to the Malawi consulate here in Johannesburg, where scores and scores of Malawi nationals had fled and taken refuge there, fearing what may happen over the next few weeks. They'd set up camp there for a few days at the doorstep of the consulate, wanting the Malawi government to help get them home. And some of the people that I spoke to were giving me examples of how they'd separated from their partners the day before, and they don't know when they would see them again. So how the logistics worked was a bus came and took some people. The understanding is they were taken to a repatriation center. So this would have been a group of women, and then men would have been taken in a later bus. So some of the men that were left behind were concerned that they don't know what the makeup of the repatriation center is when they arrive there. So they don't know if they were able to be reunited with their wives and children. children, or if their only chance of being reunited will be when they eventually land in Malawi. So those sort of concerns for people, very palpable. And some people were even telling me there that, look, they understand, some of them were confiding, saying we don't have the documentation, but things have really become so bad that we are willing to be repatriated and will not return to South Africa, fearing that this might not be a short-term problem, that maybe this might be a sign of the times globally, that the world is changing and people are wanting to be clearer on people's legal status, whatever the circumstances of what got them here.
And finally, Pumza, what will this mean for regional stability? South Africa plays such a key role in the region, as we know, but the broader impact of these demonstrations, what could it do to impact South Africa's relationships with other African countries nearby?
Look, it's already strained relations with a few African countries. We've seen what would ordinarily be behind-the-scenes discussions playing out on social media with some African countries, Ghana, for example, accusing South Africa of turning a blind eye to what they claim are abuses happening in the country. So there are tensions there now, diplomatic tensions, certainly, that will need to be smoothed out. And South Africa in the region has been known as the sort of country that is reconciliatory, that wants to reconcile and be friendly with all its neighbors. But on the other side, though, and that's something that President Cyril Ramaphosa has shown that he's willing to do, to try and mend those frayed relationships. But on the other hand, he's also said, in addition to doing that, he will be sending teams to the rest of Africa to communicate that things need to change. He wants to communicate this new strategy that the South African officials want to now follow and get explicit buy-in from African countries, saying, again, it is disproportionately burdened with having to look after, in quotes, the continent, and that African governments need to be taking a proactive stance on getting their economies up and running so that people do not need to flee for what they consider better economic conditions. So it's a twofold response so far, but certainly one where we saw the country's president there seeming to hint at a slight shift of how they will be negotiating with African governments going forward.
Yes, well, this is a story, I think, which is going to continue to rumble on for the foreseeable future and possibly something we'll revisit again. But thank you so much for outlining what's happening in South Africa for the time being, Pumza. We appreciate your time. That's Pumza Filani, our correspondent in Johannesburg. Just to remind you, if you do want more global news podcast content, do subscribe and click on the link below. For now, we'll see you on the next episode.